I love you, baby. Fala na canção. Aí você não...
All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Corning Museum of Glass, and of course our online community. Welcome to you as well, wherever you are watching with us tonight. You've chosen a very special evening to join us here. We have Davide Salvadore joining us, making a beautiful piece. Let's give him a thunderous welcome and round of applause. He is an artist from Italy, Murano. He's been over in the studio teaching this week, and so we're bringing him in to show us some of the fantastic things that he can do with glass. So I think you're really going to enjoy this evening's show. Now we have a very large team here to support him, and I think you will see why as we go along. This is going to be a very large platter that he's making for us tonight. And they said that that platter was actually meant to look like a Marini itself. So he does a lot of work with Marini, and so he's going to be making an installation that has a series of large platters that's meant to look like a large collection of Marini together. So this is the first one of the series, so we're really quite excited to see this come onto the hot shop floor, and I'm looking forward to eventually seeing that full display, which I'm sure he'll have up online eventually. So let's see, the whole team disappeared here. We've got Chris helping out tonight. We've got Pino, we've got Jeff, we've got Tom, and Ken, right? Kenneth. All right, Kenneth has also joined us here. And my name's Helen. I'll be narrating, jumping in and assisting as needed. But I'm also here to help answer questions that you might have. So please let me know, both online and, of course, here in-house, what we can do to help answer any questions that you might have for this process. Now, quickly, can I ask, is there anyone here who has never seen hot glass before? A few of you. Fantastic. Well, we're really excited to have you a part of our audience here today, because that's really what we are here to do at the Corning Museum of Glass, is to share with you this wonderful material and all the things that can be done with it. This is a little bit unusual to have such a large team gathered together here for us. We do these Thursday night live feed demos by inviting special guest artists in with us to do more complicated pieces, things that we don't get an opportunity to do on a daily basis here. So it's a really exciting time for both the team and for the museum to have and host Davide here with us here today. So we're going to have a lot of activity and a lot of things happening to bring this piece together. So let me explain a few things. We got a couple different teams going. Now over here we have Pino, and he has started to warm up a few pieces of Marini. Now Marini in its most basic form is just taking a rod of glass, chopping it up into little pieces, and we're looking at the side profile of the slice. Now that would just be a little polka dot. That's not that exciting. So we've got lots of other cane and Marini that we can play with, and if you layer up different colors on top of each other, beside each other, and build up very complicated patterns, then you slice those up, you can look at a very complicated pattern. So I'll come out here to the audience and pass around a few examples of the Marini that we will be working in this exact piece. So that's what we have on the platter here, is some of the, I believe the orange ones. There's some really bright orange round Marini with a black core on it. And I'll make my way around here as I go. I just want to explain to everyone before I do the wander. So that's what we have onto this plate. This is a ceramic plate, and it's been kiln washed. What we call kiln washed, it's just a little bit of a coating, and so that coating in theory will help keep the glass from sticking to the ceramic plate. Typically hot things stick to hot things, so if they get that plate too hot, we could get that Marini stuck to that plate and we'd have all kinds of trouble. But I'm sure they're going to do a fantastic job. So we're taking all those little chunks. Now glass, as it heats and it cools, it expands and contracts. So if they tried to shock heat these little pieces of glass, they would explode. So they arranged all of the patterns, all the Marini, onto that plate. Oh, looks like we're working on the yellow one. I was a liar. So it's actually the yellow stripes that we're using. So all these little things were warmed up in an oven nice and slow so they didn't crack. And then we can introduce them to the very intense heat of our reheating chambers to be able to melt them together. Now, we're not wanting them to puddle, but we want them to stick together. We're going to be making what's called an encalmo vessel, which is multiple bubbles joined together. So this is going to be the center or the pinnacle of our huge platter. So we need to squeeze all of these together. So the little Marini that they're working with is this yellow one here. It's got white bands in the center. You might notice that as it's really hot, it looks bright orange on the end of that, or on that platter there. And that orange color is really just looking at the heat of the material. Just like the clear glass when we pull it out of the annealer. I guess I could show you both of them while we're going here. Show you the other complicated one we're going to be using tonight. So we've got all those colors, but they look very different when they're hot from when they're cold. So you can see the bright yellow that I have in my hand is the same as the bright orange that you see down there on the plate. So we've got this beautiful colors. I'll just keep making my way up and around. And he's going to be squishing all of those together to create a nice little sheet of glass out of all those little Marini. It does look like sushi, yeah. It's sort of the same idea. If you just layer up lots of things and roll them together, and then you slice it, you would end up having basically a sushi roll. It's like glass sushi. Yeah, absolutely. Now, Davide is really well known for all of his very complicated patterning, and so this is actually a pretty simple version of some of the more complicated patterns that I've seen him make. Yeah, oh my goodness, right? Yes, that is. It's very beautiful, very complicated, and lots of color. Now, he's also working with solid color. Now, we've got a lot of options when we work with colored glass, and for the most part, we can gather glass out of our furnace. And our furnace here is all clear glass. But if we wanted to make a lot of something in particular, we might melt an entire tank of one particular color or multiple colors. See the little chunks? So if we have an entire tank, here we have only clear. So any color that we add to our pieces need to be added separately. And so one of the things that we do is to get bar color. I'll just keep them in my pocket in case anybody else wants to take a closer look. So one of the ways that we can work with color is using bar color. And while Davide's been working on compressing all of those little chunks, Chris has been working on the core of, or the edge of our plate by starting an overlay. So we can buy our colors in either little particles called frit or in solid bar chunks. And if you start with a solid bar, they've melted it in a tank like we have here, just on a much larger scale, and they add metal oxides or metal compounds into the raw materials of glass to create the various colors. So they'll get a whole tank of color, gather some out, and turn it into a rod of glass. We can take chunks of that rod and then melt it into or onto the surface of our glass. So Chris started out with just a small bit of clear, created a nice air bubble, and then they dripped a big blob of black glass over top of it. So he worked all of that black glass up and around the surface of that bubble, creating a layered effect where the core is clear, the outside is black, but by the end of the process, you'll see only the black. Because as you blow out the form, it basically creates a thin layer of color through the entire piece. And most of the work that you see here is actually made in the same fashion, applying color somewhere on a layer of lots of clear to create the illusion of a solid color. Looks like we're picking up that little plate that they all squished together. So they've made a marine or a punty there, and you can see it's picked it up. All those little individual pieces have been pressed together to create the nice little plate. and now they can squish this together to make a little cup. Now I mentioned the encalmo process. That is a process of joining multiple bubbles together to create the final form. And this will have 3 parts to it, 2 of which will be made from Marini, and 1 is the black layer that Chris started up on the blowpipe. So by the time we stack all of these different cups together, we'll end up with the core, or the center, being all of those beautiful yellow cane. The next layer will be the black cane that I showed you, the Marini, the one that looks like sushi up at the top there, said it looked like sushi. And then the edge of this, or the last bubble, the closest bubble to the pipe, will be the black layer for the edge of our Marini plate. So Chris's job right now over here on the little bench is just to get all of that black glass evenly coated around the surface of that bubble, and then allow it to cool down just slightly so they can start adding more layers of clear. So just for those of you who may not have seen a hot shop before, I'll tell you a little bit about the different equipment that we have here on the stage. Of course, we have our glass furnace, which holds all of our clear molten glass, running at a temperature around 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 1150 Celsius. So it's keeping the glass nice and molten inside of there. And for the most part, we work here at the museum with soda lime glass, which is one of the most common types of glass that you'll come in contact with. I almost can guarantee every single one of you have something on you right now that has soda lime glass. And that's going to be maybe your eyeglasses, maybe your smartphone has some glass on it. So you're going to come in contact with soda lime glass in many different capacities on a daily basis. It's one of the easiest types of glasses to make, but there's lots of different formulas. Now the colors that we're using, I know that Davide has a tendency to use a lot of solid color, so he'll make a lot of his own colors. He also uses a lot of purchased ready glass and some other types of glasses that come together, the solid colors that he uses. I'm not sure what these Marinis are made of, whether they're his melted glass or some of the purchased glass. But you can combine all of the different colors together, and as long as they are similar glasses, they will all be compatible and you can work with them together. Now that little plate, you can see they made a slight cup out of it. It needs to have that slight cup shape and have a lip, because when we join the different pieces together, they need to have matching lips. That's the only way we're going to end up having a bubble that's one bubble that has no holes in it, is if you can have the pipe will have a tube, the center will be a tube, the bottom will be a cup, and all 3 together will create one solid bubble. So we don't really need to have that right now, so we're going to park it in what we call the garage over here. And just like your garage at home, you use it to just store things and try not to worry about them. You just kind of out of sight, out of mind. But the beautiful thing about this piece of equipment is that it's around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So anything that we put in there isn't going to change shape, and it isn't going to crack. So if we keep it in its proper temperature inside of that oven or in that garage, it'll stay there, nice, safe, and happy. It's sort of our glass babysitter. So we're going to put that cup, we might put the black bubble in there. I'm not really sure how many parts we'll put into that garage, but once we have all the parts, then we can assemble them together. It's designed to have a cold side and a hot side. Over here is where the flame comes in, so of course that's the hot side. So we usually garage things on the slightly cooler side and then introduce them to the hot side right before we pull them out and put them onto the piece. So we've got our furnace, we've got our garage allowing us to keep everything and all the parts warm and allow us to get on to other activities. And we also have our secondary furnace, which we pulled out the big guns tonight. We turned on the big hole tonight. This reheating chamber is one we don't normally use. We only turn it on when we have special guest artists and big projects to work on. But we've got a few of those here in the studio. We've got four places that we could have glass blowing taking place, these reheating chambers. And those are furnaces that do not have glass in them except for what we stick in them on the end of the pipe. So they're all designed to reheat glass as we work. So it looks like they're pulling out the big plate now. So this big plate will have, I think, I didn't get a good look at it, but I'm sure we'll get a good look at it here. Yeah, it looks like we're using all those big sushi slices there. So we've got these beautiful black and white and red and yellow slices. They've been carefully arranged in a nice pattern on that plate once again. And we've also put, it looks like they've maybe got stripes in between, so there might be some other decorative elements in there as well. And then I heard them say they wanted to add clear, so I'm not sure if they'll add that or not, but I think they're going to add a layer of clear along the edge. Because this particular plate, the first one we picked up as a round plate. But this one's going to be picked up in a slightly different fashion where we're going to roll it up into a tube. So if we're looking at all the little parts and pieces, you can see they're nice and warm. Davide will start to coax them together, getting them to mount. Oh, good shot. Very nice, cameraman. We got the best camera people up here, showing you a good view of all the action. So we're getting a good view of all of those canes being warmed up. We flip the plate around to help it heat evenly. As we're heating, inside of that reheating chamber there's flames coming from one side. For this particular one, there's actually flames coming from both sides. That's why it's the big guns for tonight. But we have, most of the time, it's flames coming on one side. And as you're reheating, you're putting it in, you're taking it out. That means the end of that is always going to be hotter because it goes in first, it comes out last. So if you want them to heat evenly, you need to turn that plate and keep it consistent around as you heat. So we're going to get this all squished together, and that will create essentially a sheet of glass. And if you take that sheet, you've got a couple different options. You could wrap a bubble with it, just like wrapping a present, taking a sheet and wrapping it all the way around a bubble. That would just deposit all of those Marini onto the surface of glass to create a decorative pattern. Now, doing that method will often trap a little bit of air if you're not careful about the texture that you leave on that Marini plate. So I overheard them when we were getting started saying they were going to do a dry pickup, which means they're not going to put it on a bubble. They're just going to use the Marini itself and pick it up by itself. So you might be wondering, well, how do you do that? Well, you need to create the sheet and then create a pipe that has a collar. And when you have the collar, it's like a donut on the end of a blowpipe. You make that collar the same size as the length of the sheet so that when you roll it up, hopefully it goes all the way around that collar and meets in the middle and creates a perfect tube. So they'll be working on that here in a bit, and that'll make a lot more sense once you see it visibly if you can't understand my description. But that's the action we're going to do to put this beautiful piece together. So just coaxing it little by little. You really don't want to push too hard when you're first starting to get these put together because of the outer edges will be a little hotter than the core. So he's just gently coaxing that together to make sure he doesn't disturb the pattern very much. I'm curious what the color stripe is in there. I don't see Pino. Hey, Pino. What's the color stripe that we're doing in between? Do you know what the color stripe is in between? Yeah, the line. It's the orange? That super bright one?
Yeah, and the other one too.
That one.
Yeah, these are little spots. Green and orange.
Okay.
We have canes and orange. Kind of separate.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. So they've got a combination, orange stripes, then we also have the black and the multi, and then we've got these little bright orange spots that are in between each one of those black ones. So it's a combination of all three. So if you look really carefully, everything looks kind of brown. That's reds and oranges and tend to look very brown when they're hot. But those are the little spots that you see in between each one of the big Marini. So we're going to add this little chunk of clear glass. And the reason we're adding this cane of clear is because when we go to do the roll-up, when we're attaching it to the blowpipe, we don't want to mash up all of the beautiful little Marini. So by adding that little layer of clear on the edge, we can pick it up on that edge and fold it over and have all our Marini still nice and clean on their connection to the pipe. So it's a really smart approach to picking this up. Saves using and wasting some of those Marini. There's always going to be waste glass whenever you're making a product. There's always that extra bit that's on the pipe itself called the moil, and those are always going to end up in the trash. So if you end up taking a lot of time and energy and a lot of cost to make the little Marini, you know that they're going to be, that section of the piece will be thrown away. Why not make it out of the slight clear and a little bit more useful part you keep on the Marini itself? Any questions that you have so far? Yes. This here, right here in the, what is this? This is a piece of equipment I didn't tell you about. This is the one thing of not hot we have. This little tool here in the middle is our pipe cooler. And so when we work with the pipes, they're stainless steel typically, which dissipates its heat quite easily, but the pipes do tend to get a little too warm. And you want to be able to hold the pipe as close to the glass as you can for good leverage. The further away the glass is from center, the heavier it's going to feel. So you want to make sure your pipe stays nice and cold so you can choke right up to the glass. So that's just basically a water fountain to cool down the pipes. So he steps on the end, it makes a little water come up to the top, and we just cool down the pipes as necessary to make it safe and more ergonomic to work. Yeah, great question. Any other questions? They're way up there. Let me come up there. Davide is squishing away, getting everything set. Yes, are they natural gas furnaces? Yes, we work with natural gas here. We do have torches, which he's lighting up right now, that are propane that we can use, but most of our equipment is natural gas. We also have all electric hot shops here. If you had a chance to see one of our innovation shows here today, up in the the glass blowing up in the innovation shop. That particular shop is actually all electric, which is a very rare thing for the glass community to work all electric. Furnaces, and I would say mostly furnaces, you'll see electric, you'll see gas. It really depends on your local energy costs, whether someone builds a gas or electric furnace, because I would say gas is generally a little hotter, but more quick heat rather than slow heat. But electric furnaces absolutely can get to the same temperatures as what gas furnaces can. So a lot of the factories will actually warm it up initially and then use electric to keep the glass hot. So it really just depends on the equipment. But I've known quite a few studios that have electric furnaces that run just as hot as the gas. It just ends up being a little slower. Yeah. So with our furnaces here, we've developed the electric shops mostly because we are working out at sea. So we have an electric reheating chamber up in our innovation shop, and there's not too many of those that exist in the world, but we developed that specially to bring us out with celebrity cruise lines and work out at sea. So we've also brought those into our museum so that we can have shows and do demonstrations and help train the people who are heading out. They're nice, quiet shops. Yeah, what is the white plate that they're sitting on? It's actually a ceramic plate. We call it a kiln shelf. And glass would stick to hot ceramic. Hot glass actually sticks to everything. But if it's a plate of ceramic, we actually coat it with another layer of ceramic, and somehow that keeps it from sticking. I know that seems kind of strange, but it is basically a mixture that's put together of alumina hydrate and silica, and you paint it onto the surface, EPK kaolin, all these things. Everybody's got their little recipe. But you coat that on the surface, and it makes it less likely to stick. So when they go to pick this up, you'll look really carefully whether there's dustiness on the surface. If there is, that's the little bit of kiln wash that might have stuck, and they can brush it free. You got a question? That's a great question. How many years experience do you need to get to this level of experience? Well, Davide's been working in glass his entire life. He grew up in a family of glass workers on the island of Murano and started to go into the studios with his grandfather when he was a very young boy and learning the trade. So he's been working his entire life with glass. But typically, we say it takes a minimum of about 10,000 hours or about 5 to 7 years just to get a good understanding of what this material is and what you can do with it, to have a basic proficiency. And we're basing those numbers more on a factory approach, where like Steuben Glass, that was their factory training, that they would bring people in and you'd have to go through that certain amount of time of training before you could consider yourself a glass blower. In today's society and contemporary glass, though, I think that the rule still stands for getting the experience, but the titles and the learning process has sort of shifted. So we're learning a lot, not in factories anymore, we're learning in places like the Corning studio, where it's a public access studio that allows you to work with this material, or you're learning in universities, and universities have programs, usually an art program, material studies program, design programs that have glass, and that's where most contemporary glass workers are learning to work with this material. All right, so you can see Davide's done a beautiful job getting these all squished together, and we've got Kenneth starting that collar I was telling you about. So I took a gather of glass, that hot molten glass, out of our 2,000-degree furnace, and it's about the consistency of honey when it comes out. It's very hot and very runny. I know it doesn't seem that way because you're looking at a lot of professionals who know how to gather and control the glass and keep it on the end of the pipe. But he's taken that nice, fresh, hot gather and just blew right through the end of it, so that now it's open. The pipe is nice and clear. Davide's further poking in there, making sure that the hole is nice and clear so that they can create that little donut on the end of the pipe. And with that little donut, that will be the collar that will allow us to pick up our Marini sheet. So we need to make sure that the size of that collar, once again, matches the length of that sheet. Ooh, what is the coefficient of the glass Davide is using? Now, we're using System 96 as our base glass, but I'm not exactly sure what all the Marini are made from, so there might be a few other COEs involved in that. So, what's that? They were all made in the studio? Okay. It is all Ouroboros? And studio glass. All right, so we're all working with the same stuff. That's good. Thank you. I got the studio people just piping in here, making sure I know what I'm talking about. So it is all the same. Ouroboros glass, that's a name brand, essentially. And all of what, for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, the COE, the coefficient of expansion, is the amount in which a glass or a material will expand or contract as it's heat and it's cooled. We'll get back to that here in a minute because we don't want to miss the action. We're going to pick up this sheet of glass on the end of that collar. So you saw him give it a little wiggle. He's making sure it's not stuck, making sure it's just the right temperature. And looks like we're going to go for a little bit more heat. So he had that gut feeling. It wasn't just perfect, so he's going to go for another heat and make sure it's right. That's another sign of an experienced glass worker who can read every little sign and signal that's happening to the material as he's working with it to know whether it's time to act or time to give it a second, and then it'll do exactly what you want. It's really tricky with the timing of glass working because every color that you work with, every glass that you work with, every heating chamber that you work with, those can shift some of that sense of timing that you've built up through the years of experience. And there's general rules, but there's not really set rules. There's just a lot of guessing in glass. And the more experience you get, the better you are at that guessing game, and eventually you get more things right than you get wrong. So here we go, matching up that collar. Beautiful job. Let's give him a big round of applause for that. Beautiful job. Now you might notice that he didn't touch the edges. We don't want to seal up those edges unless it's perfect. So he's going to do that by hand with tweezers to make sure that they really match up. If you just sort of roll over it, there's a chance it could overlap those edges, which would be a bad thing. So we want those to really join together. And we just use a dust broom to dust off any residual kiln wash. But man, that looks like a very clean pickup. So excellent heating, excellent pickup. You got a question? How heavy are the poles? Well, the pipes themselves, it depends on the size of the pipe. It's a good question. Because if you're looking at a very small, what we call a goblet pipe, maybe I'll come down and show you a couple different sizes here. Or maybe Chris will pull a couple out for me. No, I'll just go in there and do it. So if we're working with a really small piece of glass and we just want to make a little goblet or a small cup, we'll choose something really small. Now Davide is really going to be working this glass down, compressing it together to create that clean tube and make sure there's no air gaps left in all the spaces between all those little Marini, because if you have a bubble with a hole in it, you're not going to be able to blow it. So if I'm making something really tiny, I'll choose a small pipe. So these are very, very narrow. You can see they don't have a big grip on the end, and they come even smaller than this. This one's only maybe 2 pounds or something. You're looking at this one. This is sort of our standard that we use on a daily basis. It's got a grip on the end to make sure that it's a little bit easier to turn. It's a little bit wider in the end of it with the head of the pipe. And so this one is more like 3 or 4 pounds. And so the bigger the piece, the bigger the pipe. So they're actually working on a very large pipe. That's probably one of our heaviest that we have here that we would use on a regular basis. And you want to scale up on the heft of that pipe to make sure that it can support the weight of the material without bending. The glass gets really soft, or the glass can be really heavy, and if the glass or the pipe gets too hot, then it softens the metal and glass can make, or it can end up bending that pipe. So it's also a matter of ergonomics. So if you're making something really big, that means a lot of weight on the end. You got to really turn hard to make that work. And so if you have a tiny little pipe and you're trying to turn really heavy things on a tiny little pipe, even if it can support the weight physically with the pipe, it makes the turning very hard. So if you size up the diameter of that pipe, it makes it easier for the glass worker to turn the pipe and support that weight and work as ergonomically as possible. Now that's really a goal. We're doing a lot of things that are kind of bad ergonomics in glass blowing. We're carrying a lot of weight on one side of our body. We're doing a lot of weird twisting and turnings. We're having support of that material. So we try to do as much as we can to make it as ergonomic as possible so that we can use, have this as a career in our whole life, and we can continue making glass as long as we want. Now, Davide's been a very active participant in this object. Of course, he's been blowing glass his whole life, so I'm sure he could tell you a few things here and there that might have built up sorenesses in his wrists or something, but in general, he's only been able to survive a career in glass because of his approach to the material and trying to work as ergonomically as possible. Is Davide left-handed by chance? I don't know how to answer that question. I'm not really sure. I think in general, glass blowing is a pretty ambidextrous sport to participate in, so you have to get really good at using both hands, but I'm not really sure about that. We'll have to ask later on. Anybody know that answer? Oh, you got another question over here. Okay. Is he left or right-handed? Right-handed. Okay, well, there's the expert answer. He's right-handed. But yeah, ambidextrous. You really need to know how to use both. Yes. That's a great question as well. What is the pipe made out of so it doesn't burn their hands? Now, these pipes are typically stainless steel. Now, stainless steel will dissipate heat a lot better than, say, a copper pipe. If we were trying to blow glass on copper pipes, you would see us holding at the very tip of it because it would get really hot really quickly all the way up. Now, of course, we have our pipe cooler. We could cool the pipe as we work, but we like to work with stainless steel. Now, there's other that just work with standard steel. Both are kind of a preference thing in the glass world. If you're working with standard steel, that means it's going to rust. So that rust can be an advantage. If I'm making a lot of very big work and I'm getting really sweaty and slippery, I might want a pipe that has rusted a little on the surface and created a bit of a texture to help me grab and turn that pipe. But I run the risk of the rust also being on the inside of the pipe, and I could blow it right into my piece at some point. So I see a lot more people working with stainless steel pipes today, and part of it is that heat dissipation and that lack of rust. It's a good question. Some good questions here tonight. Any other questions that I can answer? All right, I'm going to come up top, and I'll come back for you in a minute. Yes. The crucible that holds the molten glass, what is that made out of? So the inside of this, for those of you who aren't familiar with what we're talking about, the inside of our furnaces are either bricks or a crucible, which is basically a big ceramic bowl. Usually they're a high alumina content, and that is a material that's going to help keep the thermal qualities of the furnace, but it's also corrosion resistant, because glass in its liquid state is very corrosive. So if you're looking at our annealers are made of a soft brick, and by having a soft brick, it's got a lot of airspace, it's made out of really soft material, so you put glass on it, it kind of eats through it, like spitting on cotton candy or something. So absolutely, so the furnace itself, the bottom half of it, generally will last only so many years, and then you need to rebuild it. So if you're looking at a furnace that's had a long life, the inside surface is all pitted and big grooves. Wherever there was a little crack, now there's a huge crack, and all of that material can actually start to soak into the glass itself. So if you're gathering out of really old furnaces, you might see striations of goo in that glass, because it's actually leaching materials out of the ceramic itself. Absolutely. All right, look at this beautiful little cup we've got going on here. They've compressed all of those Marinis together and then started to create a jack line at the very top. We need to put jack lines or constrictions in the tops of bubbles to make sure that we can break them free very easily. Glass will only break wherever it is the weakest along a particular form, so we put those weaknesses in there. Yes, sir. That's a good question too. So if we're working with glass and we have eye protection on, is it using that UV protection? To a certain extent, yes, we do wear glasses. If we're working with torches that have a lot of UV or something coming off of it, we will wear specific eyewear for that. If you were a production glass blower that maybe was staring into that hole every day, all day long, absolutely, you'd wear some UV protective. But for the most part, we're wearing safety glasses more for flying objects than we're wearing them for UV protection in the capacity that we're working here. So I know it may seem like we're not wearing a lot of safety gear, but we are pretty of course, safety is the utmost concern here at the museum and in most studios. So you'll always see glasses, you'll always see closed-toed shoes, you'll always see cotton clothing, so that if you do catch on fire, you just catch on fire. You don't get shrink-wrapped with your plastic clothing. So it just you are looking at a lot of safety gear, even if it might not look like it. How's it going in there? It's looking fantastic, Davide. Yeah, it's going great. I can't wait to see this all put together. I can't wait to see it all come together.
I can't wait to.
You can't wait to? Perfect, perfect. Yeah, you always have these visions in your head. You imagine these great projects and how it's going to come together, and then it's just, this is the moment. You know, there's no going back. Once you put 2 and 2 together, once you stick 2 pieces of glass together, there's no going back. So as it's coming together, this is a realization of his vision, but it's also a coordination of a team. He's got, of course, that big team that he's working with, a lot of irons in the fire, as you say, lots of things happening around the studio. And so he's watching all of that action. Now, he's got a lot of talented people with him here today. They're probably going to have no issues, and he puts a lot of great trust in that team as they're working, allowing Chris to do the overlays and some of the key components of this project. Really shows the trust that he has in him and his abilities. But Davide's the one in charge. He's the one taking responsibility for all the action that's happening here on the stage. So he's going to pay close attention to all the things that are taking place and make sure they're going to bring his vision to fruition in a smooth manner. So nice and hot, really squishing that together. We want to make sure that it's nice and compressed, and we need to have it the same size as those other components. Remember, we've got one component in the garage right now. They're working on the second component here, which is Chris going into that furnace. Maybe we could play the video that we have. I don't know if we have the ability to do that or not, but there's a video that we have that lets you see what it looks like inside of one of those furnaces. So there's that high alumina ceramic crucible and all the hot molten glass, and they're just wind it around the end of the pipe, and you come out with a little bit of hot glass. So he's got that beautiful layer of material now, and he's going to be using a wooden block. Now, the wooden blocks that we use are really for just the first few moments that it comes out of the furnace. Because when you come out of the furnace, that glass is about the consistency of honey, so it's very runny. So you notice he's turning very slowly, very methodically. If he starts getting excited and spinning really fast, everything wings away from center and makes a big mess of that gather. So the outside layer is really hot. The inside layer was left a little colder so that it was nice and stable. When you go back into that furnace to gather glass, you want to make sure that you have a stable core. Otherwise, that black could have dripped right back into the furnace. And so we use the wooden blocks to help cool and center the outside while allowing the inside to warm up a little bit and balance out those two temperatures. So the wood is typically soaked in water because you can imagine dry wood and 2,000 degree glass, we just have a lot of flames and fire and sticky and a bunch of mess. So the wet wood creates a nice little barrier of steam, and that keeps the glass from sticking to that material. Now you might have seen that Davide took a few moments to shape it with another tool that looked like a little square. Now there's two versions of this, and he has the high-tech version. These are hand pads. The traditional hand pad is made with just a folded wet newspaper. Take the local news, you fold it up, you burn the surface, put a little water on it, and you've got a nice flexible tool that can conform to the shape of your hand. One of the newer versions is that what he had, which is a graphite impregnated pad, and we use that to help shape our glass. Now, as I mentioned, these are 3 different components that are coming together, and this top component attached to the pipe will be a tube. We need to create a tube that will match the diameter of the Marini and that little edge. So he's taking tweezers and kind of pushing and allowing it to separate, pushing, allowing it to separate. So he's squeezing the glass and pushing a hole into the end of that bubble. It's just a really nice, easy way to create that hole. You could also maybe pull extra glass and put in a jack line and break the glass off the end to create the hole. Everyone's got their different approach and methodologies to get the perfect opening on the end of that. But this is how he's doing it. It's just that little tweezer method and coaxing that glass open. Now you notice though, now that it has that opening, it's a little bit jagged, so they need to smooth that out, maybe trim away some of that excess glass to bring it back down to the right size. Any other questions that you might have? All right. So again, we're working out of the reheating chamber here today. We also have a very unique view inside of that reheating chamber as we work. Oh, there we go. Nice coaxing that open. But that unique view that you see on the inside of that reheating chamber as we work, it's made possible by a very specialized glass that Corning developed back in the 30s. And when you look inside of there, the camera is not actually inside that hole, it is behind that hole with that little piece of specialized glass separating it from the heat of that furnace. That furnace is, again, around 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So our standard glass, it is a tool that's designed to melt glass. So we couldn't just put a regular window in there. So instead, that specialized glass, which is called fused silica, has a temperature rating of about 4,000 degrees. And that keeps and protects our camera behind it. And you really only see that view in the Corning shops because it's a very complicated, very expensive little piece of glass. So we've got access to those, and we make those little windows there in the back. Here we go for the trim. Cutting glass with scissors seems like an impossible thing, but when the glass is nice and hot, and what an easy, smooth trim that was. Very nicely done. You can just use those scissors to cut through that soft material. Now when the glass is first out of the furnace, it's really hot. As it sits out into the air, it cools off very rapidly. You might have even heard by the time it hit the floor, it was a little bit cold. It kind of crunched as it hit the floor. So you've got to cut really quickly. If you start to make your way around and you get halfway around that cut and you don't finish it and the glass has gotten too cold, it'll actually start crunching and acting like cutting cold glass, as you can imagine, like hardtack candy or cutting through a window. So you always have to work very quickly to get through it. And it feels sort of like cutting through an orange peel or a marshmallow. It has a little give. But then imagine putting a hairdryer right on your thumb the whole time you're doing it, because you're looking at at least 1,500 degrees coming off there, if not hotter, most likely much hotter than that, coming off of that glass, radiating off that glass. And so you try to keep the wits about you as you're cutting and not let the pain bother you, and know that those few seconds of pain as you're getting close to the glass will pay off in the long run with the beautiful effect that you get trimming or forming a particular piece. Now, because of the intense heat that we're working with, you might also see some really wonderful assisting happening on occasion where there's a wood paddle just magically floating between, not touching glass, not touching people, it's just floating in between people and glass, and that's just an assistant shielding the gaffer from that intense heat. Got another question? How long will it take the glass to cool? That's a really good question too. Now, if we just took the glass and we set it out, within a few minutes it would get cold enough that we could touch it. But as that would cool, it would shrink. And so if we had a thickness change or anything, it would start to shrink on the outside and the core would still be hot, and then it would end up cracking. So we put them away in these big black boxes here that are called annealing ovens. So the annealing ovens allow the glass to cool down really slowly so that the outside, the inside, the thick stuff, the thin stuff, they all cool and shrink at the same rate. And that rate of cooling is based on the thickness of the piece, not necessarily the size of the piece. So if I made a piece as big as you, but I made it really thin, I could let it cool down pretty quickly, maybe only about 12 hours. If I was making something the size of your fist, I might want to leave it in there for a couple days to allow it to cool. I imagine this piece will be a couple inches thick, so we'll probably give it at least 2 days to allow it to cool, maybe 3, to make sure that it has the correct thing. Oh, we're going for the stick now. Watch this. Got 2 different parts, a perfect centered hit, joining those 2 together. and then we'll break it free from the pipe. Very nicely done. It's like you've done this before, Davide. Definitely. Very nicely done. So you can see they made them match, making sure that the two lips of the two different pieces were the same size so that when they join them together, there's no gaps. But that's also one of the tricks of the trade, making sure that as you've got that perfect diameter and go in for that final heat, when you deliver them together, that they're still the same size. Because as you're heating and you get excited because you know it's getting to that point, and you start maybe spinning a little too fast, glass will start to wing away from center. Centrifugal force can change the shape of that object. And so that's really on the assistant's part to make sure that they're heating the right place, not getting too excited and spinning the glass so it changes its diameter so that you get a nice clean connection between those two. So now we've got our two parts stuck together. We've got, again, the pipe, which has the black on the end. Then we've got all those beautiful black and multicolored Marini all put together to create that form. I'm going to get those back out of my pocket. Did we get a good picture of the Marini when we made them? I'm going to bring these over so we can put them onto the table and let you see the color designs that we're working with here. But now we've got the Marini end, and we've got a little bit more things to work on to get it shaped up. We need to make sure that that seam is nice and clean. There are no gaps. It's nice and smooth. And then remember, we've got all that clear on the end. We need to get rid of that clear so that we can attach that final piece to get the final look. I'm just going to set these little Marini on the marver here for a second. Maybe we could get a little bit of a camera action on the marver for a half second while they're reheating to show the colors and the design of this particular pattern that we're working with. Is that possible? There, yeah. Just want to show everyone at home, and of course if you couldn't see it from far, those are the colors that we're working with. These are the actual Marinis that he used for this particular piece, because the colors look very different when they're hot. All of these beautiful bright oranges and yellows and reds look very brown in the piece when it's hot. But when it cools down, we'll get, it'll return to that beautiful color. And I know that when we get this out of the oven, Amanda's going to get a good picture of it and put it up on the online as well, so everyone can see the final piece online once this comes out of the oven in a couple days. So there again, that clear was just used to help facilitate the pickup of this object, making sure the edges of the Marini didn't get too hot and too mushy. And so they're going to slowly coax that off the end and probably trim that off. If you remember at the very beginning, they created that disc, that shallow bowl of glass, and that's still in our oven, awaiting joining to the main bubble of our piece. All right, another big trim, another good assisting, making sure that the drip doesn't go back on the piece, and shielding Davide's thumb. Yeah, you can give him a big round of applause for that, absolutely. Yeah, we will never turn down positive reinforcement, so anytime you're excited, we can scream and shout and get the enthusiasm running. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, you got to keep Davide going on this. He loves the energy. And the music's so quiet, he can't hear his lovely music. We can't play the... All right, well, we'll see what happens. Yeah. So that's a beautiful trim there. We've got all the parts put together. Now we just need to get that third part added into the game. And once we get all of these together, we're only about halfway through. We've still got a lot of glass blowing yet to be done. We need to get these all joined together, and then they're going to gather over it at least once. He said maybe twice. We'll see how energetic they're feeling once we get it all together, whether we're going for one gather or two gathers, to make this nice big Marini paddle. So again, for those of you who might have joined us a little bit after we got started, we got Davide Salvadore joining us here today as our special guest artist. He's been working over at the studio, the Corning Museum of Glass studio. He's been teaching classes. We bring in world-renowned artists from all over the world to teach classes, and we try to take advantage of their presence and invite some of them to come over to the museum side to make one of their pieces or a series of work with us here in our hot shop. We've got a wonderful hot shop to work out of here, state-of-the-art with lots of wonderful equipment. And so it's always fun to get glass blowers and big teams of groups of people together to take advantage of all the wonderful equipment that we have here available to us. Looks like Tom is reorganizing some larger blocks, just like the pipes that we want to start sizing up bigger and bigger. Whoo, look at that, Bubby. Yeah, that is a block and a half right there. So we've got lots of different tools, and as we build up larger pieces, we also need to build up the equipment and work with larger pieces of equipment. All right, so we got an online question here. Why do we not treat the pipes so that they don't bend? Is that the question? Yeah. Well, I'm not sure of the alchemy involved in all of it, but I know that there's some of the pipes like that Pastorelli plate, and I think that was the specific question, is our Pastorelli plate had started to get too hot and it started to bend. So when things get hot, especially metal, they start to bend. That's just what's going to happen. So we try to build them out of particular metals that would have more strength, but it's again trying to find that balance of the weight of the object versus the utilitarian use of it. So we can't make something that's so thick and so heavy and overbuilt that we can't manage to handle it. So I would say that that's part of it, and yeah, any metal, no matter what temperature you're working with, it would eventually have that fail point. And the more you get it hot and the more it bends, the softer it gets over time. So eventually, those Pastorellis, no matter what they're made out of, they always look wrecked. Every shop I've ever been into has a Pastorelli plate or a pipe or something that's just been overheated and abused, and eventually it's just not going to perform as well as it once did. So that's a pretty good Pastorelli, though. It served us really well, and it's still in good condition. But yeah, it's just the weight of the roll-up that we had. It was a really big plate, and so that's a lot of weight, and we're just kind of asking a lot of our equipment in that particular case. Interesting question, though. Keep them coming online, folks. If you got some questions or comments that you want to share. How many people we have watching us here tonight? About 300 people watching us online. That's fantastic. Yeah, you can cheer for that, absolutely. It's really lovely to be able to have this opportunity to do these live feeds and bring all of you to us and us to you from all over the world. I know I have friends all over the world that tune into these, maybe get up in the middle of the night to be able to tune in to some of the action here at the Corning Museum of Glass. So it's a really great thing. Keep an eye on that online presence. We've got a lot of people working on keeping you up to date with what's happening and all the action here at the museum. We've been working on this Thursday night live feed project all summer. It's been really fun bringing in all sorts of artists and also featuring some of the gaffers that we have here on a regular basis, making all sorts of wonderful work. And these live feeds and just the evening shows in general have given us an opportunity to focus on more complicated pieces and really bringing a piece of ourselves into this amphitheater throughout the summer. So it's been really exciting to be a part of it. Oh, we got another question over here. Looks like they're getting ready to join that last component. We got the click, that's bring that now. He knows it's ready to go. We're gonna join that last little cap to the end of our tube and make that final connection that creates our bubble. Once again, hitting it right on center, and then using a little cold steel and a little water to separate that punny. There you go, beautiful job. Very nicely done. So now with tube, and cap, we've got a full bubble. But we gotta squish it all together and make sure it's all compact so that we can gather over it. You got a question? How do you get the pattern onto the glass? Well, this particular piece is all made with Marini. And so to make the Marini, he took individual colors. Let me see if I can get a couple things here to help with this visualization. Yeah, those would be great too. Thank you very much. So to make the simplest of all Marinis would just be a blob of glass. You pull it between two irons, it's gonna create a rod of glass. I slice that rod and look at its side, and I've got a polka dot. Does that make sense? So if I got a polka dot, if I wanna take a rod that has that running all the way through, and I wanna put 6 rods together, and I bundle them together, and I pick that up and I squish it, and then I pull that, and I slice that, it's going to be 6 polka dots, right? So if I wanted to make a complicated Marini like this, then I might make a yellow gather, and that's gonna be 1 cane, and it's got layers and overlaps. And I know he takes basically solid layers and he'll like fold them over. You ever seen anybody pull taffy? Yeah, it's kind of like pulling taffy. You like pull it out and you fold it back on itself, pull it out and fold it back on itself. So he'll make a few canes that have that folded pattern. And then we'll make another cane that's got a solid black section, and then another cane that's got a couple red sections, and he'll bundle all those together in one big package and then pull that. And so that's going to give us a very complicated Marini that's built out of layer upon layer upon layer and sliced to create the finished Marini. So we take those finished Marini and all those little slices, and that's what he had on the ceramic plate, was an arrangement of all these individual little Marini. And so those will melt into the sheet, roll them up into the tube, and we've got our beautiful pattern. So we could also take these little Marini and just gather a bubble and stick it to the side of something and blow it out. So we've got a couple different examples here. This is a little rose Marini, right? So that is a little Marini that was made and sliced and brought open. We actually were working on this for our Tiffany exhibit, and there's a whole display case over there. You can take a closer look at some of that. But there's different possibilities. There's kind of unlimited possibilities of working with glass in this Marini pattern and that application of color to the surface of bubbles, or just made fully out of Marini. If he didn't have a tank of glass to gather bubbles and he just had a big bag of Marini, he could squish them together, he could roll them on the end of the pipe, and he could make objects out of just solid Marini. And he's really well known, Davide is really well known for using almost solid color on a lot of the work that he makes. And when you're working with solid color, it makes it a little more complicated because every single color reacts to heat slightly differently. We've got soft colors, we've got stiff colors. Now, it's not a set rule, but a general rule is the darker colors like black are going to be really soft. The lighter colors like white are going to be really stiff. And it has to do with how the heat energy is absorbing or reflecting into that material. So if I have a black section and a white section, or a yellow and a red, and they're next to each other, they're going to want to move different ways as we're making the piece. And you'll start to see that a little bit as we go to further blow this particular piece out. But one of the advantages of working with so much color and so thick is that the finished pieces, Davide's going to make this beautiful vessel for you here tonight. But a lot of his work is taken in its cold state. Once it cools down, he'll bring it into a cold shop and grind through the surface of that object. Because when you're working with all of these little Marinis and all this color and you're squishing it around like we've been doing, it sort of muddles up your pattern. It squishes the surface of our pattern. We lose some of the crispness to all that application of color. And so by grinding through the surface of that, it gets back to where everything's crisp, right next to each other, without all the mushy mash on the surface. So it not only adds a beautiful texture to his final objects, and if you look him up, I know he's got a website and he's got a lot of online presence. You can just do searches for days and find all kinds of beautiful stuff for him. We also have links, of course, through the museum because he's here as our guest artist, so you can find him on our website if you can't find him individually. But we've got lots of wonderful examples of that carving, and it really just makes a very rich surface when you're working with that material. So it looks like they're getting this nice and squished together, making sure that it is nice and even. We are going to, again, gather over top of this. That means we're going to kind of shellac it with a bunch of clear. It's going to join over top of it with all of this clear glass. And so we want to make sure that the surface of this internal bubble is nice and smooth. Because the glass inside, oh, look at that shot. That's a beautiful shot of that beautiful pattern all squished together. So when we get all of this ready to be gathered over, if we have texture on the surface, little holes or any kind of dents, when they go into the furnace, the glass is very hot and very runny, but it doesn't like to fill in holes. Instead, it wants to lap over those holes. If you remember the video, you wind the glass in that bowl of, or wind this glass into the glass itself. So we want to make sure that there's no air bubbles trapped in between those layers. It also looks like perhaps there was a tiny bit of scale or maybe a little bit of kiln wash. Remember when I said that the kiln wash could sometimes stick to the surface? So they're just using a dental tool, a little bit of a diamond file dental tool to just grind that away. Just like your dentist, just grinding stuff away. So they're just getting rid of some of that contaminant on the surface. Because if we gather over it, it's there forever. And if it's different compatibility, you can end up cracking a piece by having a chunk of something in there that doesn't belong. Yes? What do we do with the leftover pieces that are cut away? Well, glass, if it's clear, we'll reuse it for the most part. Glass as a material is pretty much infinitely remeltable. And so it's important to recycle glass and things. It's less energy to remelt glass than it is to melt from its raw materials. So if it's clean and clear, yes, we might put it back into our furnace. But if you're looking at things like this, it's a lot of scraps, it's a lot of colors. If we put that back into our furnace, it'd be pretty ugly glass. I always say it's like making the soup out of all the leftovers out of the fridge. You know, it might make soup, but nobody's really going to want to eat it. So we don't really reuse a lot of the color scraps. If we were to take those scraps and put them onto an object, that's a possibility. You could collect some of the beautiful little scraps and add them to the outside as a decorative element. But typically by the time you blow an object up and then take a chunk of it, attach it to something else and blow that up, you've washed out your color. So it's not really worth reusing that color. So a lot of times what happens to the scrap glass that we have, it gets collected and either given or sold off to construction companies and different places that would use that as an aggregate in that in different applications. I know when I came in this morning on my bike, they had just painted the white stripes in the sidewalk, and it's full of glitter, what looks like glitter. That's little chunks of recycled glass that's put into that paint to create a reflective surface to allow us to see that at night. So that's one of the uses that they can use for glass. But when you're recycling glass, we couldn't put into the general recycling because it's a different kind of glass. And if we do too many different kinds of glasses, they'll melt together, but they won't cool and shrink at the same rate because they're different COEs, so you'll end up with cracks and incompatibilities in those materials. So you want to make sure you're only melting the same kind of glass when you recycle. All right, looks like we're getting all ready for our gather. We're going to let this get nice and cold. Now I say cold, but that's a relative term. We're still looking above 1,000 degrees for glass blowing. If we get it much below 1,000, it'd start cracking. So we're really just trying to get it stable. We want to make sure it's stable so that when we go into that hot furnace, one, we can control it, and two, it doesn't mess up our beautiful pattern. If it goes in too hot, it could smear. Just the torque of moving the glass can smear that design, so we make sure it's nice and stable. That's a great question. I'll definitely get to that question after we gather. So we've got, again, letting it stabilize. You can see he's putting on all the gear. They know they're going to be sizing up a little bit bigger, so they want to make sure that we got heat protective on. He's put on a Kevlar sleeve. That's a heat protectant sleeve that will help from the radiant heat. We also have our furnace. Now this furnace holds around 1,000 pounds of glass. It's a pretty big size, small studio furnace. But you need to make sure you've got enough glass in there so that when you go to gather, you can actually get it deep enough to coat the whole thing. So we had to have a certain level of glass inside of that furnace as well so that it goes all the way in for that dunk and then gathers it around. Now she had an online question of whether I was scared the first time I worked with glass, and I think this is probably one of the scariest moments of working with glass. Not cooling the pipe. He faked me out and went to the pipe cooler there. But cooling the pipe to make sure you can handle it nicely. But going into the furnace, I think, is one of those most stressful moments in the first moments of blowing glass. Because when you're looking in that furnace, it's 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take. Depends on the studio. Some people like it a little hotter. Some people like it a little colder. But it's a lot of heat pumping right out at you and your hands. Now, after you learn how to gather properly, you learn how to work at the back of the pipe and tuck yourself behind the door and do things to help protect yourself as you go to gather. But when you're first starting out, you don't know all these tricks, so you put your hand like right in front of the furnace. And you've got to hold on to that pipe and turn, and you can't see the level of the glass, so you're stabbing it way in there, and you're halfway up the pipe, and you come out and you're dripping and smearing all over the wall, and you're making huge messes. So it's a pretty intimidating moment. And I've taught a lot of glass blowing classes, and I've had at least 2 or 3 students that went in, put the pipe in, let go, and walked away. So this is a real critical moment. He's going in nice and slow, making sure that he doesn't trap any air in any residual dents that might be on the surface, wind around, and comes out of the furnace. Beautiful job. And drips it off. Now he's doing what's called a strip gather. That's just draining some of that excess glass off of the pipe into the bucket. Now, since it's all organized, it's clean, it's clear, we can reuse that glass if we choose to put it back into the furnace. But you can see he's got a beautiful hot layer of molten glass on the surface of that pattern. Now, it's one of the scariest moments, but it's also one of the fantastic moments in glassworking, that hot layer on the surface of that inner core. Because the optics of glass start really coming into play, that thick layer on the outside kind of amplifies all that beautiful pattern on the inside, so it can be a really exciting moment. You really start to see your patterning in a whole, fresh, new perspective when you've got hot glass over top of it. But you can see there's a lot of calm action. We want to make sure that that glass stays on the surface of our bubble, doesn't wing out and get all irregular. We want to make sure that it's a nice, even, steady coat on the surface of that color. If he puts too much clear glass in one side versus the other, and he tries to blow out a nice, even platter, one side's going to be fat, one side's going to be too thin. So that's where the wooden block comes into play, and that hand pad to help distribute the glass evenly around the surface of that bubble to make sure that we've got a nice, even layer. Are we going in for another one? Yeah, we are. All right, so we're going to let this cool down slightly, and then it'll go back into the furnace for a second layer. Now, when you're working with this material, you do need to, again, think of the scale in which you're working. You've got a couple limitations. One is the size of the pipe. You want to make sure the pipe can support the weight of what you pull out of the furnace. 2, you're limited by, of course, who you might be working with and whether they can pick it up or not. But we don't have a problem there. We've got quite a few talented people that are used to handling large quantities of glass, so that is not a concern. The other thing that you need to work on is the furnace and the amount of glass that you have. You can only gather as much as you have, and of course gather as much as you can go all the way into and come back out of. But you also have the door. You need to make sure you can get out of the door. So if you end up in there, and I've seen it happen, you go in, you go for that final gather, and you pick it up and you realize it's bigger than the door, it can be a bit of a problem. And you never want to be the person who does what we call a square gather, coming out and smearing it along the sides of the furnace as you come out. Because 1, you're going to destroy your piece, and you're going to destroy the furnace. It's going to put all kinds of sticky glass all everywhere, and then the door won't open and close. And I tell you, we don't turn these off unless they're down for repair. So to try to clean a hot sill full of sticky glass is not a happy day for the technician. So we try to be nice, and we try not to smear glass all over the place and go for those square gathers. Oh yeah, we got those golf gloves. Those work really well. So we're sizing up on some pipes. Yeah, you got some big mitts. I don't know if we got the gloves to fit them, but hopefully we find one that'll fit. So we're going to put on a glove, and typically you don't wear gloves when you blow glass. You would think that it would be a safer option, being able to wear a pair of gloves to be able to work with this material. But gloves are typically something that will take away the dexterity involved in the process. So you don't usually want to wear gloves because it takes away your ability to turn the pipe properly. But when you start working on larger scale items, and you start working on big pieces with this kind of big pipes, sometimes it's the grip that gets really difficult. And so he's going to put on a glove, 1 to help shield him from the heat. Yeah, big encouragement here. And also to help with the torque and the grip of the pipe. Oh, Davide's a little nervous. He's covering his eyes. He doesn't want to see what's going to happen here. Is it bigger than the door? No, he does a beautiful job. Very nicely done. Yeah. All right, so we want a nice thin layer on the surface so they're really dripping off a lot of that excess. Yeah. Very nice, Kenneth. Now, has he been over there working with you guys all week, Pino, over at the studio? Yes. Yeah, so we got Kenneth Gonzalez on the pipe there, just so that he gets his few seconds of fame. He's been over there working with the team, with the class over the past week. They got a couple more days. They're here till Sunday. Yes? That's a great question. What does the torch do? We've got all this equipment that makes all this heat. Why do we have to pull in a torch? Well, the torch allows us to spot heat-specific areas. And so if you're looking at this bubble, the end of that bubble is thickest and hottest, typically because it's the first thing in and the last thing out of that reheating chamber as you're reheating. So it sometimes makes it difficult for the back end of the pipe, right next to the pipe, to stay hot. The metal pipe itself is also robbing heat away from that glass. So by using the torch, they can start to preheat the back end of it so that it'll balance out the temperatures between the two, or make the top hotter than the bottom, allowing them to do specific shaping in specific places. So we have 2 different kinds of torches here on the stage, though. You can see the big fluffy that he's using. That one's it's hot, but it's colder than the little torch. Yeah, thanks, man. You got the example there. The little torch that you see is actually one that's traditionally used for flame working. So it's not just propane, it actually has oxygen with it as well, which means it burns much, much hotter. So we can use this big fluffy when we want to do a nice general overall heat and keep specific things hotter as we go along, or we can use that tiny torch and really get in there with intense heat, and you'll see those used most often for doing more sculptural work, where you want to spot heat maybe one little spot of an eye, or you want to make a dent where the arm's going to be placed in, and you can spot heat things as we go. If there's little imperfections, he could also get in there and put a little spot heat and melt something particularly quick and hot. But for the most part, those are the uses of those torches, is spot heating specific things. All right, so 2 questions from online community. First of which is, what was it? What would happen if you don't come out of the door, or it's bigger than when you want to come out of the door? Well, you saw the way he drained the glass into that bucket. You've got a few seconds where you could angle it and allow that to drain back into the furnace before you come out. So that's one way to try to solve that square gather issue, is just handling the glass there. Otherwise, yes, it would have been to make a big mess, and then they'd have to squish it together to get it to happen. What was the second question again? No, that's the one. How heavy it is. I'm not exactly sure of the weight of this piece, but I would guesstimate he's got maybe 15, 20 pounds, you think? 30 pounds? Okay, Jeff says 30 pounds. So a lot of weight on the end. And when you get it on the end of a 4 to 5 foot pole, it's going to feel even heavier because you're really exponentially making it heavier the further away you're holding an object. Just like if you have a bag of flour, you hold it close to you, it doesn't feel so heavy. You hold it far away from you, it will feel heavier than that few pounds. So we're starting to make the final stages, or not final stages, but the setup stages of this platter that we're making. Davide, again, is making his vision of a large-scale version of his Marini. So this will be a giant platter, and this platter itself, when connected with other platters, meant to be displayed on a large wall or assembled together, will eventually be the image of one of his Marinis or a grouping of his Marinis on the wall. So we need to set up all of these different conditions to make this piece blow out nice and even. Part of it is that balance of temperature, so using compressed air to cool areas to make sure that they don't get too hot, using the torch to focus heat in other areas to make sure that it's expanding and blowing and moving as he wants. And generally, as you're working, you're always trying to cool the end of your piece. That's really just the natural tendency. As I said, it goes in, it goes out. It's the last thing, it's the heaviest thing, or it's the tip of the pipe, the tip of the bubble that doesn't have the pipe. So all of those are typically going to be constantly cooled as you're working to make that happen. And Davide also knew exactly the shape that he wanted at the end of this process when he started at the beginning of this process. So he's setting up certain shapes, certain thicknesses. He knows the lip is going to be way out at the end and stretched, so he's probably leaving a little bit of thickness at the very edge of that lip, so that when he stretches it out, it'll still have plenty of glass to move and be equal with the rest of it. So whether you're making something tall or something wide, you never go the opposite direction before you stretch it back. Glass doesn't really want to be resilient enough to squeeze back together if you stretch it too far in one direction. It takes a lot of heat to get glass to ball back up, so it will actually ball and round up, but when you blow a bubble too thin, it's very difficult to try to compress it back together without making a big wrinkled mess of your object. Now you might also notice right here, he's using what we call a tool called jacks, and he's putting in what we call a jack line. And this is really just squeezing down the top of our bubble to create a weakness. Now, you saw him do this on earlier parts of this project. This is a very common approach to making handmade glass, is to blow out an object and make sure it has a very good jack line. Because glass on a molecular level, it's very randomly patterned. All the molecules are moving around, looking more like a liquid when it is hot. And even when it's cold, it hardens and all the molecules are still randomly patterned. It's a non-crystalline structure. So if you want glass to break, you want to tell it where to break. Otherwise, it's going to break in whatever path of least resistance in those molecules, which is very jagged and very irregular and very conchoidal in that breakage. So you'll always see a glass worker putting in these nice tight lines, these constrictions, to help dictate where the glass will break along that line. If we're working on sheet glass, whether we're doing mosaics or we're doing stained glass or we're just cutting up glass projects, we still need to tell the glass where to break by creating weaknesses, and those are typically by scratching and scoring the glass with little metal wheels or other tools that will create a scratch along that glass in a pattern. So if we can get it squeezed in, or if we can get that pattern and then break the glass, hopefully it'll follow that weakness that we create. So you can see some real great teamwork here happening. These guys are turning the pipe, and this allows Davide to really focus on what is happening on the end of the piece, really watching it as it's expanding and being able to cut in lines as needed and dictate what the rest of the team is doing. It really does take a lot of coordination to be able to make a particular piece. So if they're turning faster than he is squeezing with that tool or vice versa, they would end up mashing that line. So it really, you kind of get into a groove with the glass blowers that you're working with, and you want to try to work very in sync with how they're turning, how they're angling the glass, how they're moving, and kind of anticipate that next move. I really love these inside views that we have here in our reheating chamber. You can get a unique view of what's happening in that heat from that camera located there behind there thing. But I love to look at the bottom of the pieces. It's a perspective that generally as you're blowing the glass, you don't really get to see that angle of the pipe very often. And when you get a piece like this that has all these wonderful visual textures on it, you really just want to look at it from every angle possible. So Tom's blowing into the end of the iron now, expanding this piece. And once again, it allows Davide to be down really watching how it expands. He's using, once again, that compressed air to cool certain areas and the torch to heat certain areas. The Marini themselves, there's so many different colors involved in those Marini. We've got black, we've got yellow, we've got red, we've got a really bright orange. All of those colors are going to be moving differently in the heat. And so the thinner this gets, the more evidence that will be where it starts to move more than others. And so you really want to monitor all of that movement as it's starting to inflate to make sure that you don't get any one area too thin. So wooden paddles are a really wonderful tool to help shape glass. We use that wet wood at the very beginning to help shape, center, and cool the fresh hot glass out of the furnace. And now he's using a slightly wet paddle also just to help compress and shape the glass. If it gets to the point where the glass is fairly cool, he would not be using a wet wood paddle. He would switch to a dry wood paddle, because the surface water on that paddle on slightly cooler glass could start to actually crack the surface of that glass. That's what we call thermal shock. As glass starts to cool and it cracks along a particular area, we use it to our advantage often, like in those jack lines and other areas, but we need to be really careful not to disturb the surface of that piece. Got another question? how many burners are in this reheating chamber? I think, if memory serves, there's 2 on each side. Is that correct? Yeah. So there's 2 on each side. Now, our other smaller reheating chambers, they just have fire on one side. But with the size of this, when this is fully opened, I can kind of sit inside of this thing. Not when it's on, of course, because it's way too hot. But when it's cold, it's really big. You can practically sit inside of it. And so if you just had heat on one side, it just wouldn't cut it. It wouldn't get it hot enough. So it's actually using 2 different burners. They're located pretty far forward in there. If we got some glass geeks online that want to know a little bit more details, the burners are right kind of in the front, right behind that retention ring. Ooh, what's the longest ever taken to make a piece of glass? Oh, wow, that is, it really depends. If you're looking at Davide's methodology and the way he's working, yeah. We're talking about you, sir. We're talking about you. So we've got questions online about what's the longest amount of time you've had to spend on a piece. And if you're looking at the Marini by themselves, he can spend weeks making Marini. Week upon week upon weeks making Marini. And then hours upon hours laying those patterns out. Hopefully not as many tears as what he's feigning right there. But yes, he makes hours and hours of laying out the specific pattern. And then once you have that pattern, then you have all these different parts to make. Now this one's actually a fairly quick piece. From the work that I've worked with him before, and I've seen a lot of his work, this is actually a pretty quick piece. But when we're looking at the prep time involved, it probably took him weeks to get ready to come here and be able to make this in under 2 hours. Absolutely. So, okay, so the bulk of these particular Marinis were made during the class that they've been doing over in the studio over the last couple days. So they said it took about 2 days worth of Marini making for these. But again, these particular Marini are, I don't want to say simple because they're not simple, but I've seen so much more complicated versions of Marini come out of Davide's work. So it really is a combination of all of that prep time and all of that execution. Now, one of the things about making glass, though, is that once you start it hot, there's not a whole lot you can do to walk away from it while it's being made. So he could make parts, he could make components, he could have made all the little cups and bowls and things that were going to come together and allow them to cool and then bring them all back up in an oven and assemble them together. So I've seen a lot of work made in that fashion with him, especially some of his more complicated pieces that have animals and other structures and lots of different parts. So you could build up a month's worth of work and then have it all happen in a day in the hot shop. But you can have good long, 10-hour days on one particular piece or longer when you're working on very complicated pieces. So it looks like we're getting ready to do the transfer over onto the Punty. And this is a very classic way of working with this offhand glass. You finish kind of the bottom half of a piece when it's on the original blowing iron, and then you trade it around onto a punty rod so that you can finish up the top half of a particular piece. And so we've got Kenneth gathering up multiple layers of glass on the end of a blowpipe. And it's only on a blowpipe because we don't have a pipe of that particular size. We just chose to use the blowpipe to have a matching diameter of what we had on the pipe, just to make it, again, looking at the ergonomics of working with this piece. So he's doing what we call a cold core punny as well. He took one gather, shaped it, allowed it to get cold, and then goes for a second gather to do this additional layer. That way, the whole thing is not molten in the core while we're waiting for the surface to cool down a little bit. So a little bit colder core. This needs to be a stable connection. We want to make sure that it is not going to flop around too much once it gets transferred from iron to iron. So Davide puts it on there nice and hot, and then probably will cut in a little bit of a line. There he goes, squeezing in a little bit of a separation line. Chances are when we go to separate this, they will break it at that line and not at the connection between the piece and the punty itself. That way it can be cold worked off later or shaped without accidentally breaking part of those Marini away. So we're waiting for it to cool down. We want to make it nice and stable. We want to make sure that the piece itself does not get too cold. Stabilizing those temperatures. Glass will only break when it is below a certain temperature, so we need to make sure that jack line is maintained hot enough to not crack catastrophically, but only crack exactly where we want it to. Everybody's sort of gearing up, ready to go. A little bit of cold steel, a little bit of torch to make sure those Marinis are not getting too hot or too cold. Again, glass expands and contracts when it heats and it cools. So if it gets too cold and they go back to the 2,000 degree oven, it can also crack as it expands just as much as it could as it shrank. Little diamond file, reinforcing that jack line. A little bit of water. And the tensions are high. Everyone's holding their breath. Light little taps, all it took, beautifully executed. Absolutely. Very nicely done. Whew. Anybody else relieved? Yeah, everybody ends up holding their breath just a little bit when you trade over, especially when you're watching a piece that, again, took so many hours to put together into that piece. So we really are always happy when things go smoothly. And so far, this piece has gone amazingly smoothly. No issues whatsoever. And that really is a testament to Davide and his experience and the experience of the team and all those sense of timing that they've all built up over the years of experience of working with this material and really understanding its true nature. Again, Davide grew up on Murano, the Italian island of glassworking, and has been working in and around glass his entire life, coming from a family of glassworkers. So he's had a lot of wonderful experience. He's probably seen it all go south a lot and see a lot of successes, and has learned a great deal from all of those experiences, owning his own studio and working for other people around the world. So now that we've got it traded over onto the punty, now it's just a matter of opening this piece up to create that beautiful platter. Now we can't just do that in all one fell swing. We got to make sure that all the temperatures are just right and that it's going to coax open into the right shape. So we've got that black top on it. Black is a very soft color. Some of those other colors are a little bit stiffer, so they'll probably work a few heats just to try to balance out the temperatures and really get this coaxed open in a nice fashion. But once we break things away from the original blowpipe and attach them to the punty, we always have a hole on that far end. It's going to allow that to be flared open. Now we do have a lot of doors on this furnace. When all the doors are open, that is a lot of heat pumping out of that equipment and also losing a lot of heat out of that reheating chamber. So we want to make sure and maintain as much temperature as possible to be able to finish off this piece in a timely and effective manner. So you can see that we've got Jeff and Chris are monitoring the doors, keeping them closed when it's not being used, and also closing down around that piece to help reflect heat onto it from the doors and shield the assistants as they're reheating. Any other questions that we might have? Yes, sir. I'll come up there. I'll come a little closer. Oh, is it possible to do this outside, or is it okay to do it in the air conditioning, and how does that factor into the success of the piece? Well, I've got to say, working in a facility like this, as state-of-the-art with air conditioning, is such a privilege. It's such a relaxed and nice atmosphere to work in, nice and cool. We have these little vents in the bottom that pop up and blow air conditioning on us. That doesn't usually exist in the hot glass world. We also have the outdoor stage. Tom and I worked on there all day. I got to say, it's not nearly as comfortable to work outside. But when you're looking at 10 to 15 degrees difference, it can make a huge difference to the comfort level of the gaffer, but it doesn't have a big effect on the glass itself. It can affect maybe the tools. If the marber's really cold and you're blowing glass in Alaska, say, then the marber can chill the glass a little colder. I know you laugh, but we have cruise ships that we have to blow glass outdoors in Alaska, so it does happen. But we have, those kind of things can be a factor. But those few degrees different is not going to make a huge difference to the glass itself. Yeah, great question though. So we've switched over to some Parchovies. You saw the metal jacks that he was using earlier on to help shape his glass and cut in lines. But now that we're going from the inside, he's sort of poking with the end of those tools on the inside of this bowl to get it really set back and wide open. So we don't want to poke with metal poke ends. We want to use the wooden jacks, which are nice and fat and round. So they're like your fingers pushing on the inside of a bowl. In ceramics, you want to be able to smoothly apply that pressure. You got a question? How much does what cost? Oh, that's a good question. So how much would you sell this for? Well, I tell you, our biggest answer here at the Corning Museum of Glass, that everything that's made on this stage is priceless. And most of that has to do with, of course, the museum itself. We are not here to price and sell work. We're here to give you a wonderful example of the material and how it can be made and the fantastic things that can be accomplished with a team of people and this wonderful material. So if you wanted to know how much Davide would charge for that particular piece, you'd have to have a private conversation with him about that later on. But pricing work is a very tricky thing. You've got a lot of factors that go into the pricing of work, and one of the biggest factors, to be honest, is the fame of the glassworker. So Davide's pretty famous, so it's probably a pretty pricey piece if you were to purchase it. He's got a lot of wonderful experience. He's got a lot of wonderful collectors that have supported his work throughout his career, so he can pull a lot more for a price tag than pretty much anybody here on this team and maybe team combined. Yeah. All right, so we're slowly coaxing this open to its final form. I think there's going to be kind of a dramatic finish to this as it comes, but we want to make sure that it is all set to be the perfect temperature before they do this final dramatic finishing. So you see a lot of small movements at this point, a lot of looking at the angles, looking at the temperatures. He's looking at the glow of the material. Some of that helps him understand where it's hot and where it's not. You see the very edge of that bowl is starting to turn dark again. So we know that the very lip of that piece is slightly colder than the glass that's even an inch or two slightly further back on the piece. So the glow can help us indicate. The movement is also an indicator. You'll notice as they're reheating, they're turning very slowly. If they start turning too quickly, the glass will start moving away from center, which will be something we can use to our advantage, but not until the right moment. Now we've got Tom over here is getting ready in all of our fashionable safety gear. When this piece is finished, we want to let it cool down really slowly under controlled conditions. So we'll be loading it away into one of those annealing ovens. And so we want to make sure that Tom is nice and protected. Question. How hot is the glass probably right now? Well, if you're looking at glass in the furnace, it's around 2,000 degrees. Glass stops moving at around 1,100 degrees. So that's probably 15 to 18, somewhere in that 1,500, 1,800 range to get it to move and the way it's moving. And there might be slight differences in the different colors too, but that's probably the ballpark. Are we going for it? I don't want to miss the moment here. So as they start to build this up, you can see Tom's getting all protected in some heat protective gear, the spacesuit. As they start to heat this piece, and if we've got a great inside view, he'll wait till he's got just the right heat to start spinning faster and faster. I think they're going to touch this one more time before they go for the final shape. Yeah, making sure that lip. Can you see out of that thing, Tom? Y'all good? Now the ovens that we load these away in, those are around 905 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can imagine how quickly Tom would lose his hair when he sticks his whole head into that oven. So that's why he's fully covered in this spacesuit. It's a lot of heat protection, making sure that he is nice and calm and controlled so that he can slowly and gently lift this piece into the oven and make sure that it has a safe home. Now again, we're here with Davide Salvadore, and he is teaching over at the museum here throughout the weekend. So if you come to the museum and you want to stop by over the studio, you can see him and his wonderful team working over there at the museum. Yeah, spinning, spinning, spinning. Centrifugal force starts to take over and really form this piece into a nice platter. Beautifully done. Very nice. Yeah, that was great. So they're going to just coax this into that perfect form before putting it away. At this point, it is larger than the reheating chamber. So that's the last limitation on what you can make, is what you can fit as you're heating or what you can fit into the annealer at the end of the process to allow everything to cool down properly. And so it's a now or never situation. But you can see from the image that we have what a beautiful combination of color, very similar to the Marini's it's made out of. It looks itself like that giant piece of Marini. All of these together, when they're assembled, this is the first in a series of these platters that will all be put together to create the final vision of giant Marini's on the surface. Light taps, all it took. Beautiful piece. Very nice. Right under the mark it goes. Davide Salvadore, everyone. Fantastic. Great job on the team. Yes. If you want to take a closer look at that item, we will have a picture of it up online later on in the week. There's Kenneth, his lovely assistant, Pino, Tom, Chris, Jeff. Fantastic job. I think he likes it, folks. I think he likes it. So we'd like